Welcome to the Pro-Social Workers Podcast, the place where social work meets diversity, dialogue, and ethical practice. Here we offer courses that promote viewpoint and political diversity while fostering human connection. And the best part? Our content is completely free to access. For professional social workers and interested others, we provide the option to earn continuing education credits with a simple fee after listening to our episodes. Go to prosocialworkers.com to learn more. Together, we'll explore how to truly put the social back into social work. So tune in, get inspired, and join us on this journey towards a more inclusive and connected future.
Hello and welcome to the Pro-Social Podcast. My name is Matt Watson. I'm the Executive Director of Pro-Social Workers. Pro-Social Workers promotes viewpoint and political diversity in social work education and practice. We seek to humanize, we strive for dialogue, and we stand for ethical principles, and in our case, specifically the ethics and principles of social work. And today I'm joined by my co-founder of Pro-Social Workers, Xander Kaag. He'll introduce himself and then introduce our guest, Jason Littlefield. Xander.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. Hi, everybody. I'm Xander Kaag, licensed clinical social worker, as Matt said, and I am going to introduce you to Jason Littlefield. Jason and I connected through, I can't remember if it was Institute for Liberal Values and then Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism or the other way around. You'll let me know, Jason. But we've been involved in both of those organizations and have continued to stay connected with each other, remain friends. And he came up with this concept or theory of empowered humanity theory and wrote a book about it. And so we've asked Jason to come today to talk to us about what are the social work applications of the empowered humanity theory. This will be part presentation, part conversation, because Jason is the expert in empowered humanity theory and Matt and I are the social workers. And so we're going to be having a conversation to see how these two ideas interrelate and overlap and how they can influence each other, and in what ways empowered humanity theory can benefit you as a social worker, not just in your practice, but in your daily life as well. So welcome to the
Thank you, Xander. And as far as our timeline origin story goes, the founding of ILV and when we were with the Foundation Against Racism and Intolerance, that was kind of about the same time. So it's like the chicken or the egg type situation. I'm not sure which came first, but it was, I would say it was definitely the summer of 2021 is when we first encountered each other and realized that we were doing complementary work in different fields.
Absolutely. So why don't you tell us just a little bit more about you and where this empowered humanity theory came from, and then we'll just jump right into talking about this impact or this overlap between our two fields.
Sure thing. So my background is in education. I've been working with youth, essentially the age of pre-K and all the way to college, university students, which I'm still with since 1994. So I have a long history of working with children and adults in many different capacities. My background is also just a natural curiosity in history. That was my undergrad and what I've taught, and I'm currently still teaching again. And that curiosity in history, combined with my time working as a social and emotional learning specialist in Austin ISD from 2014 to 2021, really started to shape what I now call empowered humanity theory. And we'll get into what the specific attitudes and practices are, but I began developing the attitudes and engaging in the pathways of practice that I'm encouraging others to myself back around 2016, 2017, encountering some of these ideas and theories as a social and emotional learning specialist, because at the time I was going through a really difficult time. So I began trying some of these things out myself. And it was really encountering the neuroscience of well-being by Richie Davidson that really got my attention. and started my own thinking in my own personal life and journey. And then around 2019, 20, I began to notice that the attitudes and practices that I was developing for myself, they actually address the heart of the matter of what we call diversity, equity, and inclusion, because those were the concepts that were entering my workplace at the time. But I understood my background in history understood that the new framing of diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice were done through essentially a political lens. And what I am proposing is a neuroscience based lens that is apolitical, acultural. It's completely, agnostic, but it's just what the neuroscience says. If we do X, Y, and Z, our life outcomes will be richer, and so will our relationships. So essentially, that's what empowered humanity theory is. It's these attitudes and practices that we can engage in on a daily basis that actually strengthen the best aspects of what is encoded in our DNA and really mitigate those primitive reactionary thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that essentially have got humans into trouble and difficulty and chaos and wars and anxiety and depression and all of these things for eons.
Well, that's great. Jason, that sounds very similar to kind of where we've been with pro-social workers, that what you're describing seems like pro-social principles, yet they don't necessarily need to be politicized. And sometimes politicizing those pro-social principles can have a counter effect or can get a little bit ideologically orthodox rather than inviting pluralism and valuing those relationships. So I'm eager to hear what you have to share here. This really intrigues me.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to sharing for sure. So I guess, do you want me to start with these 3 objectives what we're going to cover?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Awesome. So we'll apply the 3 EHT attitudes, the valued-centered identity, the dignity lens, and the compassionate-inquisitive mindset to enhance ethical decision-making, reduce bias, and strengthen therapeutic alliances in social work. And then we'll integrate the 3 pathways of practice, practices that build awareness and equanimity, that celebrate our common humanity, and practices that build kindness and compassion for self and others. And that's a key thing I want to just emphasize here is that kindness and compassion for self and others, because I think it is so easy to think of being kind and compassionate for other people, but we often neglect ourselves. And for the social worker audience, I really want to emphasize that because I know the social workers spend their entire careers, their days taking care of caring for other people, but it's really important that we care for ourselves as well. So I just want to really emphasize that and use these 3 pathways of practice as tools for self-regulation and co-regulation in client interactions and crisis response and trauma-informed care. And then finally, we're going to identify how empowered humanity theory supports the National Association for Social Workers' ethical values of service, dignity and worth, social justice, and integrity, and apply these connections to real-world social work scenarios, including conflict, burnout, and emotionally charged cases. So why do social workers need empowered humanity theory? Well, social workers obviously have a high exposure to trauma. There's ethical complexity. Compassion fatigue is a very real situation. Just the increasing amount of client crises and the need for self-regulation and relational presence in order to do the job that we want to do. You know, as social workers, we not only carry stories, but emotional loads, ethical dilemmas, and systemic pressures. Empowered humanity theory gives us a way to stay grounded in our values when the work gets heavy.
Absolutely. It doesn't really matter what population we're working with, right? The exposure to trauma is going to look different, based on our setting and the population we're working with. whether it's with children in child and welfare services or with veterans at the VA or a school social worker in K through 12. I mean, it in private practice and community mental health, it doesn't really matter. And even those of us who are doing social work outside of therapeutic settings, community organizing, working in constituent affairs in a politician's office, right? We're still going to be encountering people who are suffering, who are dealing with issues of marginalization, oppression, like homelessness, poverty, right? So it doesn't really matter what kind of social work we do and who we're working with and where we're doing that work. We are going to be exposed to a lot of different types of difficulties and challenges and traumas. And when we talk about self-regulation, even self-care, we talk a good game, right? People are always talking about, don't forget your self-care, don't forget your self-care. But what does it really mean, right? And what is the difference between self-care and self-comfort, right? They're not the same things. And so I'm really looking forward to, hearing more about how EHT applies, because this is about self-care. It's not getting a mani-pedi or a massage. That's self-comforting and soothing. It's not care. It's not long-term. That's short-term. So, yeah.
Well,
And then
self-care,
how do we remain present? You're right. Like, how do we remain present when we know that the next day or the next person we see is going to have a whole new thing that they're going to be dealing with that we have to be present for.
well, and self-care is part of the latest version of the NASW Code of Ethics, the National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics. So this is really interesting, Jason. Keep going.
For sure. Yeah, I'm not gonna stop down on the self-care bit like I'm tempted to, because I've spent the past year and a half really thinking about what self-care means and applying those things to my own lives through that EHT lens. But we can have that discussion later for sure. But let me get into what is empowered humanity theory first of all. So empowered humanity theory is a neuroscience-informed framework that strengthens well-being by cultivating three core attitudes. The first attitude is a valued-centered identity. This is leading and living my life, filtering my thoughts, my feelings, and my behaviors consistently, if not constantly, through the lens of my chosen core values of gratitude, dignity, and humor. Those are my three chosen core values. So I try to make sure that my life is in line with those values when I need to make an important decision, when I'm going through a difficulty. I lean into those values for guidance rather than leaning into any external labels or expectations that have been placed on us. It's just this living as whole as we can from the inside out. And then the second attitude is a dignity lens. This is not only honoring the dignity and worth of ourselves, but also of others. And we can really say of all people, and add the little asterisk of especially during conflict or when things aren't easy. Because when we honor the dignity of others, we can maintain a trusting relationship, which is necessary, especially in that social work. But we also mitigate the amount of harm, intentional harm or unintentional harm, that we may do. And this idea I really took from Donna Hicks's research and work in dignity. And her research determined that the root cause of all harm is our dignity violations. Whenever we feel like our dignity has been attacked, this is when we can lash out. This is when we can spiral into, a depression or an anger. We lose relational trust. So by honoring the dignity of others, we can really mitigate those things. And it cuts down, we're this inherently tribal species. We get into these us versus them conflicts all the time, even on the most mundane level. But that dignity, it can prevent that. And then the final attitude is developing a compassionate-inquisitive mindset. We typically process our thoughts, especially our initial thoughts, through a lens of judgment, we categorize things as either good or bad, or through that fear lens, because those are the oldest ways of our brain processing and thinking and receiving information. But whenever we can notice, whenever judgment or fear pops up in a way that is not trying to keep our physical bodies alive, which is most of the times, and we can replace those with curiosity and compassion, we can actually solve problems better, and we are able to be more creative in our thinking, and we are able to be more trusting in relationship with others if we come from a place of curiosity and compassion rather than naturally come from a place of fear and judgment. So
Jason,
it's
that's really great because, again, for our population, for our audience, not just non-social workers, but social workers in particular, because of the code of ethics, again, this aligns so well with it because one of our values is the dignity and worth of the person, as well as the importance of human relationships. And so these things just naturally melt together, what you're describing and social work values, not to mention our emphasis on service. So this is there's definitely some commonality here.
yeah. And then so there's three pathways of practice. The attitudes are strengthened by intentionally engaging in these three pathways of practice. And the first one is practices that build awareness and equanimity. And equanimity is that ability to remain calm and observing things unfold as they happen in real time without casting judgment on them, which this is a really important skill for social workers because, social workers are in situations to where things are escalated and there's chaos involved, but the more that we can stay grounded in that chaos and aware of what's going on and just see it unfold rather than react to it. Now, of course, this is a situation where physical safety is guaranteed, but just to practice in that equanimity, and the neuroscience, this is, mindfulness is an example of a practice that builds awareness and equanimity, but just journaling, self-reflection, breath work, all of those are examples of practices that build awareness and equanimity. So as many times in a day that we can engage in those practices, we're actually strengthening the neural pathways linked to our psychological well-being. And the same goes for practices that celebrate our common humanity. How many times in a day can we identify similarities that we have with others, especially our clients that we have? And I'll talk more about that in a second. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. And then finally, once again, is practices that build kindness and compassion for self and others. And these three pathways of practice are based off largely of Richie Davidson's work, The Neuroscience of Well-Being, because these are three neuroscientifically validated areas of practice that are shown to strengthen the neural pathways linked to our psychological and social emotional well-being. So let's look at a value-centered identity. This is the first attitude, and I went into this a little bit more, where I went into it a little bit earlier. But this is where identity is guided by internally chosen values, reduces reactivity in crisis, and strengthens our boundaries, and it's aligned with the value of integrity. So let's look at a practice that we can do. Something that we can think. Xander, I heard you mention something along these lines earlier, but just, perhaps when we're in our car about to visit our next client, when we're about to go to work, do something, we can ask ourselves, what value do I want to embody in my next client encounter? And really call that value to mind and filter your thoughts, your feelings, and your behavior through that particular value.
Yeah, I mean, this gets right to the crux of, the well-being, right? The wellness work, because, in the work that I do as a wellness workshop facilitator is I tell people, you know, you have your emotions, you have your thoughts. These things just emerge. It's involuntary. It's just what your brain does. It's what your body does. It sends you signals. And what you have choice over is, what is the response to that, right? Are you going to react, or are you going to pause and then respond? And when you act from these things, is your emphasis on acting from how you feel or what you think or what you value?
Yep.
Right.
And
So if we
Xander,
can reorient, right, reorient to what we value, we can go, oh, this thing is happening. I don't like it. I'm feeling this way about it. I'm thinking this about it, but I want to be oriented towards my value. So I'm going to behave in this way. It doesn't mean we agree with what's happening. It doesn't mean we like what's happening, but we find that way to pivot
yep.
away from that.
Yep. And Xander, you mentioned something about the space between how we respond or react to something. The more we engage in those practices that build awareness and equanimity, the larger that space is between stimulus and the way that we respond to it. That's what the neuroscience shows us about those mindfulness and awareness practices, is that they actually, the more we do them over time, they give us a longer space in real time so that we can properly choose how we want to respond to something rather than react in this primitive way that we have for millennia. So the next attitude is the dignity lens, and this sees the inherent worth of every client, and once again reduces implicit bias, supports trauma-informed practice, and it's aligned with the National Association of Social Workers' value of dignity and worth of every person. I want to mention the fact that, we both are using this word dignity, but it's how are we being intentional about it? And in my book, I really break down dignity by separating the human from the being in that term human being. And I like to think about the human is essentially the culmination of our biology and personality. As many different people are on this planet, that's how many different humans there are. But our being is underneath our human part, and all beings share two distinct qualities, and that's the desire to avoid suffering and the willingness to alleviate suffering when we encounter it. So that dignity lens is honoring that human that we see that may be different from us, but also at the same time, we share 99.9% DNA with them. So we are way more alike than we're different. So focusing on that alikeness, and then that we share something even more profound underneath that human level. So whenever we see each other through that lens, rather than the us versus them tribal lens or seeing you as an other, we actually build psychological capacities that prevent us from harming that person or people that may look or think like those people. And then opposite of that, whenever we do primarily perceive others as an other, we build psychological capacities that justify harming those people. So that dignity lens is really this intentional practice of how do we see ourselves and how do we see each other in a way that prevents us from harming each other and doing more proactive, creative, solution-focused work together.
That's great. That aligns really well with our pro-social workers' values of humanizing, striving to humanize as much as we can. So this is excellent.
Wonderful. Thank you, Matt. So let's look at this. Seeing the person behind the story. This is kind of a dignity practice. We can just kind of take a slow breath in to relax a second, and then a slow breath out, and just kind of let our bodies settle a second. So this is actually shifting us into that prefrontal cortex so that we can have a little bit more clarity. And then now let's bring to mind, maybe this is for our social workers out there, bring to mind a person that you'll be interacting with, or a client who feels maybe a little bit challenging. We all have challenging people. And then gently ask yourself, what might this person have lived through that I cannot see? You know, this creates immediate empathy and reduces that implicit bias and that us versus them and that judgment. And then we can ask ourselves, what might their behavior be protecting? What pain or unneed met might be underneath? And then we can just choose a dignity action. So the next interaction you have with this person, perhaps we can listen without interrupting, use the client's preferred name, validate an emotion that we see from them, maintaining a warm tone, slowing our pace when we talk, express appreciation for their effort. We can choose one of those, or we can choose as many of those, but those are all dignity affirming actions. And you'll notice that they're not grand gestures. That's the beauty of empowered humanity theory is it's not some big grand gestures. They're just these really small intentional steps that we take every single day. And our third attitude is the compassionate-inquisitive mindset. Here, curiosity reigns over judgment, and it helps de-escalate conflict, builds rapport with resistant clients, and is an active ingredient in motivational interviewing. When a client shuts down, reacts defensively, or challenges us, we can pause and ask, what pain is beneath this? And curiosity opens that connection. Perhaps when a teen rolls their eyes, when a parent yells, when a client shuts down, this mindset helps us pause and ask, what is going on here? How can I be helpful? Is there suffering that I can alleviate? Rather than casting judgment ourselves, getting defensive ourselves, and missing an opportunity to facilitate healing, facilitate trust, or to facilitate that vulnerability, which all of those are needed as social workers. Here's another exercise that we can do. We'll take a slow breath in and then gently let it out. So social work is a profession of holding stories, holding emotions, holding hope when others can't find it. And sometimes in all that holding, we forget to hold ourselves. For the next minute or so, I'd like you to bring your attention inward with kindness, the same kindness you so easily offer to others. Bring to mind a moment from the past that felt a little heavy or a little complicated. Not to relive it, but just acknowledge it. Now place your hand over your heart or over your shoulders where it's just gently relaxed on that clavicle. And silently say to yourself, that was a moment of stress what I felt makes sense, and I'm doing the best I can with the tools I have. I deserve the same compassion I give others. I am worthy of rest. It's okay that I can't fix everything. My limits are human, not failures. Let your body breathe that in and just give yourself that grace and compassion that you so generously give others. And then when you are ready, you may gently bring your attention back to the room and the space you are in and notice the steadiness in your breath. Notice the dignity in caring for yourself. And remember, the more compassion you offer yourself, the more compassion you will naturally radiate to those you serve. You deserve that care too.
Thank you, Jason. That was really nice.
You know, we so neglect treating ourselves with that grace and kindness and compassion. You know, I think social workers and educators share that, in that we just are so give, and we can realize when it's too late, maybe, that we're all give out. But if we give ourselves that compassion and kindness on the daily or whenever we need it, then we won't feel that burnout feeling. So now we can move into the 3 pathways of practice. And once again, they're awareness and equanimity, those that celebrate common humanity and build kindness and compassion for self and others. And I went into a little detail on those earlier, so I won't go into more detail now, unless y'all have questions or comments about these 3 pathways of practice.
No, this is great. Keep going.
All right, so here's another activity that we won't necessarily have to do right now, but just for our social workers, here's a tool for that toolkit. I'm not sure if you guys have ever encountered frustration or anger or confusion when you're in the field working with your clients. Uh, but so those difficult emotions, what the research says is that they last about 90 seconds unless we add more fuel to them. And I know that I've been in situations years ago where something bad would happen. You know, I would have one of those difficult emotions, and throughout the hour, or maybe even throughout the day, I would remind myself of that situation, and I would get myself all worked up again, which can impact, as an educator, it could impact my full day, and it could impact relationships that I had with students. It could impact student learning. And I think that as social workers, there could be a lot of damage done if we are not fully regulated ourselves. And social workers and educators, and even the designer of empowered humanity theory, are human beings, and we can step in it and slip up from time to time. But simply, whenever we notice these difficult emotions, whenever they pop up, because they will, if we can simply observe them as they are and say things like, feel frustrated, or I feel sad, this is a moment of suffering. Whenever we can simply observe those difficult emotions, notice the body sensations. You know, do I feel heat? Do I feel pressure? Do I feel tension in my shoulders? Just simply notice those things. We can let those difficult emotions pass in that 90-second period. Then we can give ourselves a moment of grace and self-compassion after that difficult emotion, and then we can move about our day fully regulated and fully ready to listen and work with others. So just once again, whenever we notice those difficult emotions, simply voicing what that emotion is, observing it without trying to change it, without trying to fix things. What the research says that after about a minute and a half, that situation will be over. So don't feed those negative fires that try to take over us. So here's where empowered humanity theory and the National Association for Social Workers Ethics kind of align. Empowered humanity theory reinforces service and compassion practice. Earlier, Xander, you talked about social justice through these two different lenses, but social justice through that dignity lens. Herein how I broke down that human and the being, it really puts this idea of social justice in a different realm than what we talk about now. And I would love for us as a species to get to the point to where we're talking about social justice through that dignity lens rather than a political lens. And then, the dignity and worth, that's our universal humanity. Integrity is values alignment. Like that's what integrity is. And then human relationships need curiosity and presence. So it from looking at this, it looks like empowered humanity theory is the playbook to achieve those ethics.
Yeah, I'm wondering if maybe not right now, but maybe when we get into a more of a Q&A, I'd love to if we could parse out, this with this new lens. It's because Matt and I have had, we've done other courses where we've talked about critical social justice lens, classical social justice lens, and it's like, oh, well, dignity lens,
Yeah.
right? Like this is a completely different because it's taking it out of, again, the political, and critical and classical are much more in that sort of, you know, philosophical. So maybe we can do that, a little bit later on, and sort of like, what does it look like? And how can we actually pursue social justice through that, with that dignity lens as the overlay?
Oh, that would be incredible. So here's a scenario, a parent, and I'm going to lean on you guys for this as well. A parent in a CPS case becomes angry, accusing the social worker of a bias. We can ask which EHT attitude could help the social worker respond. Actually, that the answer there is all three, and I'll talk more about how those are later. But we can lean into our values for anchor. We talk about that compassion and curiosity because I'm sure this person is like, why are they angry? When we lean into that curiosity, it's like, why are they angry and what is going on here? Or we could get defensive and protective, which won't do any good. And I'm curious, which social worker value does that support? And again, it's all of them. They're all intertwined with each other, and that's what's beautiful.
That is because social work is a values-based profession, and those 6 values, guide what we do. But then you, of course, integrate the application of those values into the unique circumstances of this individual, and see the dignity in each of them. The dignity and worth of the person invites unique application of different values and perspectives and approaches.
And then here's a common humanity reframe. This right here, before a client can trust my guidance, they need evidence that I'm whole human too. Someone who understands, struggles, has emotions and imperfections. If I lead with humanity, they can relax their defenses because they see I'm not here to judge them, but to walk with them. One of the, I guess, I don't want to use the word trick, but that's the first word that comes to mind. A mind trick, if you will. One of those practices that celebrates common humanity is if we as social workers can let our clients see us as human beings rather than someone that is there to judge or try to fix them, they're going to work with us more as a partner and an ally than somebody that sees us as an outsider that is, I guess, maybe trying to be nosy or tell them what to do or tell them how to live their lives. So simply, examples might include naming a common experience, a common emotion that the person has demonstrated. Simply we can acknowledge our own emotions. We can say, I care about this conversation, or I care about you. We can affirm their courage. We can highlight a shared value. That's another thing, is that whenever we know what our clients' values are and we can embody those values in the way that we treat them, they're going to see us as more of an ally, and they're going to put their guard down a little bit and perhaps reveal the real honest ways that we can help them, because that is our job ultimately as social workers, is to help them. So whenever they can perceive us as humans, obviously I think it's natural for us as social workers to view our clients as human beings. But if we can take the extra step to get them to see us as human beings, that's another way that we can build that relational trust that we need. And then just quickly, the neurobiology of social work present. Stress is our limbic system activation. Curiosity, we get to hang out in that prefrontal cortex where we need the creativity, the morality, the ethics, the executive function to do all of the things that we need to do. And then compassion is this co-regulation. We get to help others regulate their nervous systems as well. And then the values is this long-term resilience. So a way that we can prevent burnout through empowered humanity theory is it reduces our emotional fusion. It anchors us in our purpose, builds meaning from challenges. And that's something that's been really important to me in my life, is the challenges that I face. No matter how prepared I am, there's challenges that pop up. And the way that I respond to those challenges has been extremely beneficial to my life. And that's what I'm hoping others will transform as well. And it restores our compassion capacity. Sometimes with that compassion fatigue, we can feel maxed out and our capacity for compassion is just gone. But by continuously practicing compassion and for ourselves, and just even those awareness practices throughout the day, just taking a simple breath and slowly letting it out can regulate our nervous systems. So if we're doing that throughout the day, throughout the week, across the years, that's what helps us prevent that burnout.
Jason, quick question from the last slide. Can you just give us a quick description of what emotional fusion is?
Mm, how can I word this? Mm,
Can I give it a try?
yes.
Within acceptance and commitment therapy, that's a particular model of psychotherapy. There is this similar thought or feeling of over-identifying with the fusion, psychological fusion or cognitive fusion, is over-identifying with your internal state, or over-identifying with a thought, or giving it more emphasis or more value than it actually needs to have. And so if
Yeah.
used with your emotion, you take something that is 90 seconds long, if we were to use that paradigm that you described, and we would essentially invite you to see that as a trait rather than as a state, as a circumstance. Oh no, this is the way it's always going to be, or this is how I am, or this is what it means. I'm a depressed person, or this is who I am. And to some degree, linguistically, our English language tends to facilitate that because we use the same verb for both states and traits, whereas, some languages, some cultures, they have different verbs for states and traits.
Yeah, exactly. And it also, just to, I guess, piggyback on that is, and maybe even simplify it, it would be just being very reactive and that overreactive to the way that others think and feel about you. Really, sometimes we hear people say, oh, I don't care what you think, or I don't care, but it's this, whenever we let others' opinions of us or thoughts or really get to us, even if those thoughts are perceived rather than being real. So really letting, I guess another way to say it would be letting other how you feel. I hear from kids a lot, he made me mad. Well, no, we chose to be mad what this person did or what this person said or how this person feels about you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, because now it makes sense, because it's, I'm familiar with, emotional dysregulation, but I guess what I hadn't really considered was, why might that be happening? It's
Mm-hmm.
because there's an enmeshment or a fusion with the emotional state. There's no separation, you know, or like you said, so and so made me mad, or, you know, that executive order makes me mad or makes me afraid, right? This inability to separate those things. That kind of sums up a lot of what we're sort of dealing with just in our day to day, not just our work, but just on social media. It seems like this emotional fusion is just all around us.
Yep, yep, and that's why, we can choose to engage with that or disengage and not let others' perceptions or thoughts or feelings about us negatively impact our own thought process. And sometimes that's a really hard, challenging thing to do, but leaning into our values, leaning into self-compassion rather than judgment, uh, and the fact and acknowledging our common humanity are strategies that build the capacity to not let others' thoughts of us impact us so much. Well, that brings us to this quote here, and what I love about this bridges history with social work. Jane Addams, was a pioneer in the field with the Hull House in Chicago. I've been teaching high school students about her for decades. But I love this quote. It says, "The good we secure for ourselves is precarious and uncertain until it is secured for all of us and incorporated into our common life." And I feel that's what empowered humanity theory, is that framework to do so. So thank you for inviting me and having this conversation and the questions and comments that you posed throughout.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jason. Could we take a little time and maybe just ask a few questions and just tell us a little bit about how you have seen this applied with different people that you work with? Tell us maybe some success stories or ways that it's made a difference, not just for yourself, but for other people.
Sure thing. So I would say that my main source of success stories comes from a school district in Maryland, in Dorchester County, Maryland. They hired me the summer of 2021. They brought me out to do a 2-day training for their newly established social and emotional learning team. And then the morning of the second day, my person of contact said, "Hey, I went home and found some more grant monies. Would you please train our administrators and social workers in this framework?" And I did, and they've brought me back every year to do multiple projects. One project, I worked with a leadership team on how to transform the climate and culture of the building. It was This was the most chaotic learning environment in school that I had seen. And working with the leadership team, they completely transformed that campus, and their test scores were the highest that they've been in 5 years. The number of office referrals has declined over the years. I'm currently working with the infants and toddlers team, doing some in-depth professional development with that group. And then I am also developing a curriculum for 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds that teachers, as of 2 weeks ago in the district, started using those younger age groups. So we're getting it in place. My hopes are that others across the country, not just in K-12, but in all industries, would adopt this particular lens for how their organization works and how they are interacting with each other.
That's great. What about with adult populations or young adults? You mentioned you worked with college or university settings. Can you describe a little bit about that?
Well, in those settings, I am not doing day-to-day direct teaching on empowered humanity theory. I work with university seniors that are doing their student teaching process. So I coach and guide and do some observing through them. But the way that I personally work with them is through that EHT lens, even though I'm not doing any direct teaching of that to them myself. And then when I work with high school students, I teach history 4 days a week. I teach high school American history, and I teach history through that dignity lens. I talk about the atrocities that we have had in this country and on this planet through that dignity lens. But I have taught in the moment students, self-regulation techniques, when students are on the verge of having a panic attacks, or when I'm working with other campuses and I encounter students in crisis, I will show them some basic self-regulation techniques, and they are they're simply blown away. I remember one time, I don't know what happened this day, but I encountered 6 different students in crisis in 6 different buildings. But I showed them some self-regulation techniques, and then they said, "Wow, how did you do that?" And I said, "I didn't do anything." I said, "That was you and your breath. And the thing about that is you always have your breath with you whenever things feel very heavy and chaotic. Just remember that." So, it's just sharing it as I come into contact with others whenever I see that it's needed. That was the reason why I wrote the book last year and the workbook last year, so as a way that, okay, maybe this is an easier way that I can disperse this idea into the general population.
Jason, what I'm thinking is, I'm curious if those student teachers that you're working with, when they're talking with their cohort of student teachers, right? I would imagine there's an opportunity where they all come together, maybe, with somebody else. And if the people or person that you're working with is recognizing how differently you're relating to them than the other teachers are relating to the other student teachers. Like, if you're transferring this information in a very natural way, and in the same with the students, where you're coming from a dignity lens when you're teaching about the raw truth of our history in this country and around the world, if there's a knowingness somehow that they're getting the same information but in a different way.
There may be something to that, because I did win the field supervisor professor of the year award last year. So there may be something to that. And I know that my students are very appreciative of how I coach and how I mentor them. There may be something to that.
Well, congratulations on that. That's
Thank you.
remarkable. Maybe this is a good place where we can jump into what I was suggesting earlier, because let's just take teaching U.S. history to high school students. You could teach that course from a critical perspective or from a more classical kind of liberal perspective, and you're teaching it from the dignity perspective. Can you sort of give us an example of an event in U.S. history where how you would say how that lecture or that, whatever I forget what the terminology is, right? The thing that you're teaching about, the lesson, right? The lesson for the day, how differently it might look from those three lenses, right? From the critical to the classical to the dignity. Is that something that's kind of easy to do, that like you could do it really quickly to just kind of show
I,
even just the different language that's used, the different emphasis that might be used?
yeah, I think perhaps the critical lens would blame, perhaps it would blame white people or white men for the injustices. It would pin the harm and the intention on that group of people. And whereas the dignity lens, I do talk about how what happens is when groups of people organize by their groups and they see other groups as less than human, as something that they can exert power and control over, it builds these psychological capacities that allow us to justify each other. And we talk about Jim Crow, especially because I'm in Texas, in case you can't hear that. But we talk about the awfulness that was done, and that it was done because viewed other people as less than human. And I'll talk about how that there were some white people that rejected Jim Crow, and there were Black people that participated in some of the awfulness as well. So really try to break down this color, this group of people are good and bad, rather than saying, within all of us, we have the capacity to do great harm and great good. And whenever we view others as less than human or different, it justifies us doing great harm to them. We talk about the treatment of the Native Americans as well. That's what allowed for those things to happen. So I've always studied history as like, okay, why did those awful things happen? And what can we do today and in the future to not repeat those awful things again? So it's kind of that dignity lens and that common humanity lens is looking, because there's the Armenian genocide and the Cambodian genocides, and there's all of these awful things across continents and across time, but they all go back to the same root cause of how are we perceiving each other. And the critical social justice lens, it asks us to perceive each other as different, and it asks us to perceive each other as assuming some people have power and privilege because of their exterior makeup. And that's simply not the truth.
So group identity, polarizing, seeing people through the lens of their tribe or their class, their gender, sex, race, religion, political identity, all of those different types of different identity markers. The NASW Code of Ethics encourages diversity in each one of those domains. Sexual identity, gender identity, all of these things are identified in the Code of Ethics, making space for that. But what I'm hearing you say is, rather than see the world through group identity, see each individual through a dignity lens. And if you see the individual, the group thing is secondary to the individual, that we can see the importance of each one of those persons, which one of those characteristics.
Yes, if we see something, if we see a person primarily as something other than a whole, complete, complex human being, we are actually building capacities for us to do harm to that person.
Interesting.
You know, I know a lot of people that talk about how open-minded they are and how kind and compassionate they are, but they always seem to have a group of people that they have absolute disdain for.
Hmm.
So a way that we can break that down is when we see each other primarily as an individual, whole, complex human being, it breaks down those walls. And me personally, I have no desire to hate or to dislike or to distrust an entire group of people based off of how they look, believe, or vote.
Interesting. Great.
Jason, I'm wondering if, before we wrap up, you've mentioned your book, right, on empowered humanity theory. Would you like to just really briefly tell us about this AI tool that you've developed where people can use EHT as a tool in their lives?
Oh, sure thing. So for ChatGPT subscribers, I created a custom GPT and I fed it with my book and my workbook and some of the other research that I've done around empowered humanity theory. So it's called the EHT Companion. So if you're curious about the duality of human nature, if you're curious about how you can develop the EHT lens for yourself, if you need maybe some assistance or coaching through a difficult patch that you're going through, the EHT companion is there to serve as a guide, as a mentor, as a teacher. Perhaps you're trying to develop a new attitude or a skill within yourself. The EHT companion can help with that as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you. That's very interesting that that we have that capability and that AI can facilitate something as meaningful as the dignity lens and that being value centered and the compassion and the curiosity mindset. So thank you for your work there.
I appreciate it.
And we've got on air, if someone wants to get in touch, json.littlefield@gmail.com is your email. And we appreciate your work here. Jason, it's interesting to see how many theories, how different theories align and support the NASW Code of Ethics and the work that we do with others. Moral foundations theory, Jonathan Haidt's work there, it is another theory that we have drawn upon and emphasized. And I think the more that social workers and others can be aware of kind of these guiding principles and these guiding foundations, they can really help inform the work that we do and put into practice some of the things that we do. So thank you very much for your time today. And we hope to be in touch.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it and the conversation.
All right. You take care.
Thanks, Jason.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Pro Social Workers Podcast. We're grateful to our guests for sharing their insights, and to you, our listeners, for being part of this journey. If you'd like to earn continuing education credits, don't forget to visit our website at prosocialworkers.com, where you can register, pay a fee, complete a course evaluation, and take a quick quiz. We look forward to having you with us next time as we continue to explore how we can put the social back into social work.